Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, I would like to invite you into a Paris that much of the modern world can now only imagine through memory, paintings, and the empty spaces between the monuments that still remain. It is a Paris where, along the grand axis of power and beauty, there once stood a palace that no longer exists today, the Tuileries Palace. For centuries, it stood there as a political heart of France, witnessing glittering ceremonies, royal footsteps, whispered intrigues, the tremors of revolution, and at last, a sea of fire great enough to erase it from the city's skyline. And yet, the strange thing is this: even though that palace has vanished, Paris has never completely forgotten it. If you walk through the Tuileries garden today, if you look along that solemn, majestic line stretching westward from the Louvre, if you stand for a while within that open space, you may begin to sense that this place once held far more than what the eye can still see. Tonight, we will journey back to the Paris of horse-drawn carriages rolling over stone streets, of gardens trimmed like a declaration of power, of gates that opened not only onto architecture, but onto some of the greatest chapters in French history. We will not hurry, we will move slowly, as though strolling through a city revealing itself in the soft light of late afternoon. Adjust your pillow, let your shoulders relax, and allow the rhythm of the outside world to drift a little farther away. And if you would like, leave me a comment telling me where you are listening from and what time it is where you are. And now, come with me back to Paris, before the Tuileries Palace was consumed by fire. Let us begin not with ashes, nor with tales of uprising or fire, but with the image of that palace itself when it still stood firm in the heart of Paris, as though it had never known the fate waiting for it ahead. Picture a long and majestic mass of architecture, stretching across the horizon like an outline of power beneath the sky of the French capital. Its steep roofs, its rows of windows repeating in solemn rhythm, its pale stone facades catching the soft gray light of Paris and returning it in a kind of noble silence. Before it lay an expanse opening outward like a declaration. Behind it, a garden drawn into order, where the trees, the paths, the flower beds, and the water itself seem to have been persuaded to bow before the human will. When the Tuileries Palace still existed, it was not merely a residence. It was something more like a presence, an object capable of compelling the city around it to rearrange itself, to leave it room to breathe, a line of sight, a silent yielding of space. And perhaps that is why it is so difficult to believe that a place which once appeared so steady, so enduring, has vanished entirely, leaving behind only the garden, old paintings, drawings, memories, and an emptiness that can only be understood by imagining backward. But tonight, we will do exactly that, and we will do it slowly. We will not begin with catastrophe. We will begin with the ground, with the earth beneath the palace, with the patch of land that existed long before the first walls were raised, before this place became a symbol of monarchy, of revolution, of empire, of collapse. Because before every great structure in history, there is always a time when that place was nothing more than an open stretch belonging to wind, mud, grass, footprints, labor, and the very ordinary needs of a city growing outward layer by layer. If we wish to understand what the Tuileries came to mean in the history of France, we must return to the moment before it was a palace, when that land still lay at the edge of Paris, untouched by the language of ceremony or grandeur, merely a tract beyond the city walls where people worked with their hands and left behind their name, not in chronicles, but in fired clay, in the imagination of many people. Old Paris often appears as though it were a city completed very early, as if it had always been the Paris of boulevards, bell towers, palaces, squares, and immortal monuments. But no city is born complete. Paris in the Middle Ages and the early Renaissance was still a body stretching, expanding, testing the shape it might become. The city had its old cores, its walls, its gates, its crowded and carefully defended quarters. Yet beyond those rings of limit, there were still lands not fully tamed. They might be fields, open ground, storage places for materials, or the sites of smoky, foul-smelling trades that the urban center preferred not to hold too near. And the ground on which the Tuileries would later rise once bore traces of that same ordinary world. It did not begin with marble or decorative tapestries. It began with clay. The very name Tuileries itself is like an echo from that humble past. It is tied to the tile kilns, the workshops where roof tiles and bricks were once made in this area, where clay was dug up, kneaded, dried, fired, and turned into the tiles that would cover the roofs of houses and buildings throughout the city. If we linger here for a moment, we may find that there is something quietly beautiful in that. Before this place became the domain of kings, it was a place where materials for ordinary rooftops were made. Before it became the center of ceremony, it belonged to labor. Before it had grand rooms, corridors, and staircases meant for courtiers, it had the fire of kilns, the mud of clay, and the rough hands of workers whose names no one remembers. History is sometimes like that. Places that will later be seen as the highest symbols of power often begin with things very humble, almost invisible in the common memory. We may imagine this ground on a windy day before the palace appeared, not entirely peaceful countryside, and yet not fully part of the capital either. The earth was perhaps uneven. Here and there lay patches of mud after rain. Elsewhere were wheel tracks, piles of materials, places where the soil had been dug up. The air carried not the fragrance of royal gardens, but perhaps the scent of damp earth. Smoke, charcoal, and fired clay heating and cooling again. There were likely not as many people passing through as in the heart of the city, but it was not empty either. Some hauled goods, some carried clay, some stacked tiles, some moved back and forth between the city and its outer edge. Such a place was not glamorous, but it had its own rhythm, its own usefulness, and it was precisely that usefulness that marked the first beginning of this place's history. For many centuries, European cities were built not only out of ideas, but out of materials, logistics, transport distance, human labor, and the capacity to organize. An area with good clay, capable of producing bricks and tiles, capable of feeding construction, always possessed practical value for a growing city. Paris at that time was not yet a city of straight boulevards and calculated lines of sight. As it would later become, it was a living organism in the act of growing, where the need to build was ever present. And there, the land of the Tuileries had no idea that the name attached to its tiles would one day become the name of a famous palace. There is something very slow in such a transformation, very human. History does not always turn in a single day. Often it begins only when a parcel of land, once used for one purpose, gradually becomes desirable for another, higher, larger, more ambitious one. That turning point came in the 16th century, and to understand why, we must meet one person, Catherine de' Medici. But even here, we will not rush to see her as a legendary figure stepping forward to change the destiny of a place with a single gesture. It is better to imagine her as a widowed queen living in an age of instability, a powerful woman of determination, fluent in the language of courts, symbols, and architecture, and aware that the place where power resides is never merely a place to live. It is a declaration. It is a stage. It is a way of arranging the world so that every gaze understands who occupies the center. After the death of Henri II, Catherine lost not only her husband, the king, she also entered a deeply complicated political phase, where power, anxiety, and the need to control the image of the court became tightly bound together. Paris at that time already had the Louvre, but the Louvre of the 16th century was not yet the Louvre the world knows today. It still carried within it many older layers of history. Many remnants of fortress and royal palace accumulated over time. Catherine wanted a new place, a space more in keeping with the spirit of the Renaissance, more open, more breathable, with room, with gardens, with a way of existing different from the older, denser architectural masses. And so, in 1564, she ordered a new palace to be begun on that very ground once associated with the tile kilns. This act was not simply the building of a home, it was a redefinition of space. A piece of working land on the urban edge was pulled into the center of royal imagination. Clay and tiles gave way to drawings, stone foundations, columns, roofs, the rhythm of facades, entrances, and from there, a new story began. Let us linger a while longer at that first construction site, because there is a special beauty there when a palace is built. The first thing to appear is not perfection, but disorder, foundation pits, hammer blows, timber braces, ropes, carts carrying stone back and forth, builders, carvers, carpenters, laborers, surveyors, overseers, before it became an elegant surface across which generations of rulers would pass. The Tuileries was a place full of dust, full of voices calling to one another, full of materials lying scattered under sun and rain. Perhaps this, too, is a very good way to remember great monuments. Behind the finished beauty we see in the end, there is always a stage when nothing is complete, when everything exists in the condition of becoming. Every palace was once a construction site. Every power once began with the digging of earth. Perhaps it is here that the Tuileries began to acquire a particular quality in the history of Paris. It was not born as a completely separate block detached from the city, but as an outward motion of the city toward the west, a way of pushing the skyline of power into a new zone of land. When the foundations were laid, not only was a building being formed, but a direction in the development of Paris was being quietly established. Later, that area would become part of the greatest urban axis of the city, drawing the gaze from the Louvre through the Tuileries and farther west beyond. But at that first moment, no one could yet see the whole future. All they saw was a palace being raised, a parcel of land changing hands, a royal will pressing itself upon the ground and demanding that this place take on a new form. What is worth remembering is that Catherine's original palace did not entirely match the final image later generations would evoke when speaking of the Tuileries. Over many reigns, the building was altered, expanded, connected, added to, reshaped. The Tuileries was a structure that lived through centuries. It was not a fixed object appearing whole from the beginning. And yet that beginning remains crucial, because it shows us that the palace did not descend from the sky like destiny. It was the product of circumstances, taste, politics, symbolic need, and a deliberate choice of site. Catherine could have chosen somewhere else. Paris might have developed along a different line of sight, but she chose that very ground, once belonging to the tile kilns. And from that decision onward, the land left behind its former life and entered the greater current of history. Imagine the late afternoon light over that ground in the early years of construction. The light falls low across the scaffolding. Piles of stone cast long shadows. The sounds of hammering and sawing begin to fade. A few workers sit down to rest and brush the dust from their sleeves. Some look back toward the city proper, where the roofs of Paris crowd beneath the gray gold light. Others turn to look at a section of wall that has risen another little way, and somewhere among them. Perhaps none imagined that the work they were doing would one day become part of a national symbol, of paintings, of revolutions, of historical flames. For them, it may have been nothing more than another day's labor. But great history is often made of countless ordinary days like these. A stone placed in the right spot, a wall raised a little higher, a decision to continue work again the next morning. There is another emotional layer to the beginning of the Tuileries as well. The sense that power is always searching for space in which to tell its own story. A palace does not merely protect the body of the ruler, it protects the image of the regime. It creates the necessary distance. It organizes entrance, perspective, ritual access. It teaches those who step into it to understand where they are going. From the moment Catherine conceived the idea of building the Tuileries, that land ceased to be merely functional ground. It became a sentence written in architecture, a statement made in stone, declaring that power can take an ordinary place and transform it into the center of a symbolic world. And yet, paradoxically, because power left so deep an imprint on that place, centuries later it would also become an object of rage, of attack, of burning, but that belongs to later chapters. Tonight, we stand only at the threshold, where the transformation has just begun. If we listen closely enough, we can almost hear two layers of sound overlapping on the early ground of the Tuileries. One is the older sound of clay, kilns, carts carrying materials, of a laboring urban edge. The other is the newer sound of drawings, royal construction, directives, measurements, foundation work. A place rarely changes by erasing its past completely. More often, the past remains, like the deepest layer of memory. And perhaps that is why, even when the Tuileries later became magnificently grand, its name still preserved something of its humble origin. Not every palace carries within its very name the trace of ordinary labor. The Tuileries did, and that is what gives its story, from the very first chapter, a quality at once sorrowful and beautiful. As night gradually fell over 16th century Paris, that new construction site must have fallen quiet as well. The wind passed over ground in the midst of changing shape. The timber of the scaffolding creaked very softly. The newly set stones still held the warmth of the day and slowly gave it back. In the distance lay the old city with its roofs and churches, its narrow streets, its shops, its cooking fires, its lamplit rooms. And here, at the edge of that world, a palace was beginning to rise out of a land of tiles and mud. It was not yet the symbol later generations would remember. It was not yet the palace of dynasties, not yet the prison of a king, not yet the stage of empire, not yet a heap of ashes. It was only the beginning, but sometimes the beginning already contains the whole destiny. It is simply that no one can read it yet. And so, as we leave this first chapter, what lingers is not the splendor of the Tuileries in its completed form, but the sense of a piece of land being chosen, being transformed, being drawn out of the ordinary into the extraordinary. A tract that once made tiles for the roofs of Paris was beginning to become a shelter for power. A fringe of the city was beginning to move into the center of history. An unfinished structure was already quietly calling the future toward itself. And beneath the first stones of that future palace, there still lay the memory of clay, of kilns, of anonymous hands, things so easily forgotten, and yet the true foundation of all the splendor that would come after. If, in the previous chapter, we were still standing on a piece of land being chosen, still hearing the hammer blows and smelling the damp earth of those first days, then tonight we will go one step further. We will look at the Tuileries not merely as a structure rising from the ground, but as an idea beginning to position itself within the space of Paris. For a palace, especially a palace built for power, is rarely constructed simply to stand alone. It is always placed into some kind of relationship with the city, with the landscape, with other monuments, with the gaze of its own age and of posterity as well. And for the Tuileries, the most important relationship from a very early moment was its relationship with the Louvre. It was not a country house set apart from the capital, nor a wholly independent palace lying far from the center. It was conceived as part of a larger axis, an extension of power, a mass of architecture that, if seen in the right way, would always remain in dialogue with the Louvre across from it. That may sound perfectly natural when we look at Paris on a map today, but in history, it was a great ambition. Paris did not simply happen to possess those long, straight lines of sight and those tightly bound spatial relationships between symbols of power. Such things were created gradually, across generations, by people who wanted the city not merely to exist, but to say something about order, about the state, about beauty, and about the place of human beings in a world that had been arranged. From the moment of its birth, the Tuileries had already begun to enter that language. It was placed to the west of the Louvre, as if opening a new direction of vision, a new movement of the capital, an open stretch that would later be extended even farther. In other words, the Tuileries was not simply a palace that had been built. It was a way of saying that power now wished to breathe more broadly, to look farther, and to arrange Paris according to a more refined visual logic. Try to imagine what it must have felt like for someone living in Paris at that time, when the city still retained so many medieval features in its narrow streets, its crowded neighborhoods, its uneven facades, its winding paths, and its open spaces not yet organized according to the symmetry later ages would admire in such a city. The appearance of a new palace, with its mass, the rhythm of its facades, and above all the idea of space surrounding it, must have created a very different sensation. The Tuileries did not occupy space merely through material presence. It occupied space by compelling the very atmosphere around it to change. It needed room in order to be seen. It needed setbacks, approaches, gardens, openings. And it was precisely this that gradually made it cease to be a solitary structure on an old parcel of land and made it instead a new nucleus within Paris's urban imagination. And yet, for the Tuileries truly to become the palace facing the Louvre, more time was needed, and other political hands as well. What Catherine de' Medici began did not at once become the whole that later generations would know in the history of French royal architecture. It is rare indeed for any building to reach its final form within a single lifetime. The Tuileries was no exception. It was altered, expanded, extended, repaired, and redefined across many phases. And it was through that process that the ambition to connect it to the Louvre grew ever clearer. Not merely as two buildings standing near one another, but as two poles within the same order of power, two parts of the same story. We may pause here to feel the beauty of that very idea. There is something deeply characteristic of great monarchies in the fact that they do not simply want a place to live. They want to organize the space around that place into a system of symbols. A long corridor may be more than a passageway. A courtyard may be more than an empty expanse. A garden may be more than a place where trees grow. All of it can become language, language spoken in stone, in grass, in lines of sight, in distance. And when the Tuileries was placed in relation to the Louvre, what was being created was not merely the convenience of moving between two places. What was being created was a way of seeing power as something continuous, extended, grounded, possessing both past and present, inheritance and the ambition to reach farther. In the years that followed, under Henri IV, that idea was pushed forward with greater force. Henri IV was a pragmatic king, but also one with vision in the reorganization of Paris after the devastation of the wars of religion. He understood that building was not merely beautification, it was political action. A city that was repaired, connected, stabilized, and expanded also sent out a signal that order was returning in that context. Linking the Tuileries with the Louvre meant something far beyond aesthetics. It was a kind of declaration that royal power was not fragmented, not temporary, not housed in disconnected masses of stone, but was moving toward a form both enduring and coherent, capable of imposing its image upon the capital. Imagine a morning in that period, when the work of construction and adaptation was taking place not at a single point, but along the whole stretch of space between the Louvre and the Tuileries. Carts of stone rolled over roads not yet fully level. Surveyors walked with measuring rods and cords. Overseers discussed height, length, the need to open some section further, the need to adjust a certain facade. There was the sound of horses, the sound of wheels, the sound of people calling to one another across a broad court, and within all that rough-edged labor, something profoundly elegant was slowly coming into being, a new conception of how power might inhabit a city, not only behind walls, not only within sealed rooms, but in the very way buildings looked toward each other, connected to each other, and compelled the eye to move in a certain direction. It is here that we begin to touch what would become one of the deepest characteristics of the Tuileries itself. It did not exist only as an inside, but always needed an outside to complete its meaning. A palace becomes truly a palace only when one can approach it across an expanse of space. Pause before it, see it from afar, watch it emerge against the sky, and feel oneself moving from the ordinary world into one organized by ritual and power. For the Tuileries, that surrounding space gradually became almost as important as the building itself. The emptiness before the facade, the approaches, the courts, the axes, all of them were extensions of the palace. They allowed it not merely to stand, but to appear. Then came the garden. And here, the story of the Tuileries begins to take on a particular charm. Because if the facade and the corridors spoke in the language of architecture, the garden spoke in the language of order imposed upon nature. The Tuileries garden did not immediately attain the famous form later generations would associate with it. But across time, especially when André Le Nôtre intervened in the 17th century, it gradually became a model of the French formal garden, straight, balanced, axial, terraced, with rows of trees trimmed not simply in order to live, but in order to serve the greater composition. It is strange to think that the trees, the paths, the flower beds, and the water here were not merely nature being cared for, but nature being trained to participate in the visual ritual of power. If one were to walk in that garden once it had taken shape, perhaps what would impress most would not be beauty alone, but the feeling that everything had already been thought through. The paths opened outward as though inviting the step, yet at the same time they guided it. The rows of trees gave shade, yet also formed frames of vision. The water reflected the sky and clouds, yet also kept the composition still, balanced and calm, and behind all of it, the palace rose like a stone anchor for the entire landscape. One begins to understand why the Tuileries could not be separated from the Louvre, nor from its own garden. It was one link in a wider chain. Architecture, landscape, city, power, all joined together in a staging at once refined and profoundly ambitious. Perhaps it was also during this period that Paris began to learn how to live alongside a new kind of performative space. For once, a palace like the Tuileries had been placed in a relationship of facing and extension with the Louvre. It was not only the king or the court who benefited from that arrangement. The entire city was drawn into it. The people saw Paris changing its shape. Lands that had once been peripheral were gradually becoming part of a broader center. Roads, approaches, promenades, open vistas for the eye, all slowly altered the city's habits of perception. The craftsman, the small merchant, the laborer, the soldier, or the woman walking past that district with her child may not have used phrases like visual axis or coherent order of power, but they would still have felt that this place was different. It had a different atmosphere, a different breath, a different silence, as though even the wind passing through here had to move in formation. But the beauty of the Tuileries did not lie only in its solemnity. It also lay in a very Parisian contradiction. The place that was most royal gradually became a place the city itself also wished to draw near. Over time, the Tuileries garden became one of those spaces where people came to stroll, to rest, to watch, and to be watched. Of course, access was not equal for all, and French society of that era was by no means an open world. Yet, the very fact that part of the royal space had begun to enter into a relationship with the public was what made the Tuileries so distinctive. It was not a remote and isolated fortress. It stood there, within sight, within the rhythm of life, within the daily imagination of Paris. It was both near and far, both present and distant. And it was precisely that feeling that would later give the events that unfolded there a far greater weight. Try to imagine a spring afternoon in the Tuileries district once everything had settled into shape. The light slants down over carefully tended grass. White gravel on the paths reflects the sun. A few ladies in long dresses pass slowly beneath the rows of trees. Their attendants remain one step behind. In the distance, there may be the sound of hooves, the sound of wheels striking stone, the song of birds hidden in foliage trimmed into neat forms. And on the other side, the Louvre stands as something older, heavier, more burdened with memory, while the Tuileries stretches outward like a newer, airy gesture facing it, not to erase it, but to form with it a pair of power. A contemporary entering that space likely would not have felt they were living inside a history lesson. They would simply have felt that Paris, here, had been arranged in order to impress. From this point onward, something very important also begins to emerge. The Tuileries was not simply an appendage of the Louvre. It had its own character, its own function, its own rhythm of life. Yet because it stood in relation to the Louvre, that character became all the more distinct. If the Louvre carried the feeling of the thickness and layering of older power, the Tuileries often suggested something airier, more outward-facing, with its garden and its open expanse, with its capacity to enter into a softer kind of dialogue with the city. That does not mean it was less powerful. On the contrary, sometimes the most effective power is not the kind that crushes with thick walls, but the kind that seduces through order, through beauty, through its ability to make people accept a certain arrangement as though it were natural. Perhaps that is also why the Tuileries gradually ceased to be merely a place built to the west of the Louvre. It became a point of support in the way Paris told the story of itself. Later, when the great axis of the city continued to stretch toward the Place de la Concorde, the Champs-Élysées, and farther still, people would be able to look back and see that the Tuileries had once been an important link within that whole movement. But, at the stage where we stand now, what matters most is the feeling of the beginning of a long vision. Not every structure is fortunate enough to be born within a great idea. The Tuileries was. It did not turn its back on the city. It did not hide itself away. It was made to look, to be looked at, to open a dialogue in stone with the Louvre and in landscape with Paris. Of course, history is never made up solely of the will of architects and kings. Around those courts and gardens, there was still the real life of the city: street vendors, coachmen, servants, guards, gatekeepers, children, dusty shoes, idle chatter, whispered politics, curious glances cast toward that form of power, which was always both alluring and remote. This is worth remembering, because from the very moment it was positioned as part of the axis of power. The Tuileries also began to gather around itself layers of civic life. It was not only a place where the court thought about itself, it was also a place where Paris thought about the court, and those two lines of thought would not always, in time, remain in harmony. When night fell upon the Tuileries and the Louvre, Perhaps what lingered most deeply was not the noise of construction or the footsteps of passers-by, but the parallel presence of two masses of power in the darkness of Paris. On one side stood the Tuileries, younger, more open, opening toward the garden and the line of sight. On the other stood the Louvre, more massive, carrying within itself thicker layers of time. Between them stretched a space gradually being organized into a deliberate relationship, and above it all was the sky of Paris, slowly changing color through twilight, as though the city itself were learning how to contain within its body an ambition greater than before. And so, if Chapter 1 was the story of the ground, of the humble layer beneath, of the tile kilns, of the decision to build, then Chapter 2 is the story of vision, of the fact that a new palace was not merely erected, but placed into a relationship that would shape it for centuries. The Tuileries began to look toward the Louvre, and in that act of looking, it also began to look toward its own future. It was no longer merely a building rising from an old tract of land. It had become part of a larger urban dream, a dream in which power wished to appear not only in sealed rooms, but in the entire composition of the city. And as we close this chapter, we may keep in mind an image that is very light and yet enduring, a quiet afternoon over a garden still taking shape. The Louvre on one side, the Tuileries on the other, and between them, Paris slowly expanding the breath within its own body. Two masses of stone, two chapters of monarchy, two rhythms of architecture facing one another in pale light. There is no fire yet, no uprising crowd, no empire or ruins. There is only the slow arrangement of a historical stage. But as we know, the stages built most beautifully are sometimes also the places where the greatest tragedies will one day arrive. If, in the previous chapter, we stepped back and looked at the Tuileries in relation to the Louvre, as though watching two masses of power slowly learning how to face one another in the heart of Paris, then tonight we will lower our gaze a little, closer to the ground, closer to the paths, the rows of chairs, the carriage wheels, the dust-stained shoes, the whispers, the small yet enduring rhythms of life that unfolded around the palace across generations. For no structure, no matter how grand, truly exists by itself alone. A palace may be raised by the will of power, but it only truly enters life when the city begins to move around it, when people pass by it, look up at it, draw themselves out of its shadow, or come to it as a familiar part of their daily rhythm. And over time, the Tuileries became such a place. Not merely the residence of kings or emperors, but a distinct atmosphere within Paris itself, where the splendor of the court and the deeply human life of the city were always touching, sometimes gently, sometimes tensely, but rarely ever fully apart. Let us begin with a morning. A Paris morning not yet too loud, when a thin mist still holds a little of the night's moisture upon the leaves and over the gravel. The early light passes through the rows of trees in the Tuileries garden, not yet harsh, only enough to make the foliage appear softer against the pale sky. In a place like this, the day does not begin with loud calls, but with small movements. The gardeners have likely risen earlier than most. They move along the paths, checking the flower beds, trimming branches not yet in order, sweeping fallen leaves, preserving the appearance of order that both court and city have grown accustomed to seeing here. In a royal garden, even nature must awaken properly. not in the wild manner of unchecked growth, but in disciplined flourishing, pruned, guided, and bent toward an idea greater than itself. A little farther off are the palace's invisible servants, the ones carrying things, the gatekeepers, the cleaners, the messengers, the attendants awaiting orders, the men clearing the way for carriages to pass. A place like the Tuileries never entirely sleeps, even while the great rooms within remain quiet, even while the curtains are still drawn, even while its most important figures have not yet appeared. There is always a layer of silent life at work around the palace. Just as the heart of a city does not beat only when crowds gather, but also in the small tasks almost no one notices. Someone must open the gates. Someone must inspect the carriage wheels. Someone must see which path is clean, which stone step is slippery, who is permitted to enter, who must wait if one looks closely. It is precisely these quiet labors that allow power to preserve its outward appearance of calm. Then the city begins to draw nearer, not all at once, but in layers. The first carriages appear. The sound of hooves striking stone is dry and even, like a familiar rhythmic undertone from old Paris. Wheels roll past, and not all of them belong to the privileged. Some carry goods, some carry passengers. Some simply pass through because that road offers a convenient path across a part of the city increasingly shaped by the Tuileries district. Pedestrians begin to appear in greater numbers as well. Some are neatly dressed, walking slowly as if allowing themselves to be seen. Others move more quickly, because they have business elsewhere. Some merely pass by, letting their eyes glide over the trees, the walls, the gate, the way one does before a sight too familiar to be astonishing, yet still too important to be met with indifference. As the Tuileries garden gradually became a space in which the public could be present to a certain degree, it began to live a double life that was very Parisian. On the one hand, it remained an extension of power, a domain to be maintained, guarded, organized, and always tied to the image of the court. On the other hand, it also became a place for strolling, resting, conversing, observing others, and enjoying a very particular urban luxury, the privilege of inhabiting a beautiful space without necessarily owning it. That may sound ordinary to us today, but for centuries, to step into such a highly symbolic garden was itself a socially meaningful experience. People did not come only to breathe the air. They came to take part in one of the city's softer rituals, where status, clothing, attitude, distance, and gaze were all quietly displayed. Perhaps that is why a day at the Tuileries never belonged to only one kind of person. On a fine midday, one can imagine many layers of Paris present here. Even if they do not fully mingle, ladies in elaborate dresses walk slowly so that their skirts do not sweep too harshly across the gravel. Gentlemen move with the bearing of men accustomed to being noticed. Their canes like elegant punctuation marks in the rhythm of their stride. Servants linger just behind, close enough to await instruction, distant enough not to intrude upon the social space of their masters. There are guards, there are laborers, there may even be children with their families, gazing curiously at fountains, statues, and rows of trees arranged so neatly that to a child's eye, they must seem like a labyrinth someone deliberately made orderly. And within all these movements, the Tuileries appears not merely as a palace or a garden, but as an open-air stage upon which Paris performs itself. But every stage has its rules. Even though the garden was opened to the public, access was never entirely equal. There were written or unwritten rules that determined who was suited to that space and who was regarded as out of place. This gave the Tuileries a very delicate tension. It was public, but not equally so for everyone. It was a place one might enter, but not everyone who entered would feel truly welcomed. The presence of guards, appraising glances, standards of dress, of manner, of status, all of this made the garden both open and closed at once. And perhaps that reflected Paris across many centuries with perfect accuracy, a city that could be generous in appearance, yet always unmistakably clear about its social boundaries. Let us pause for a moment over the chairs in the garden, because that small detail says a great deal about life around the Tuileries. A public chair may sound trivial, but in a garden arranged like this one, a chair is not merely a place to sit. It is a sign that this place has ceased to be merely the backdrop of a palace and has become a space meant to be experienced in slow time. People sit down in order to look, to talk, to rest, to be present. And when someone sits in the Tuileries garden, they are not merely in a green space. They are seated in the shadow of power, within the structure of order, within a part of Paris designed to make an impression. They may not think of it in those terms, but the human body always senses such things as distance, geometry, light, gateways, walls, statues, facades. One does not need to understand all of architecture to know one is in a special place. There are also sounds peculiar to Paris around the Tuileries, and if one listens long enough, they begin to form a very gentle musical background to history. The crunch of gravel beneath shoes, the soft brushing of fabric as people change direction, birdsong among trees so carefully trimmed that even the shade here seems disciplined, the sound of carriage wheels arriving and then departing, human voices not raised too loudly, because a place like this naturally encourages people to lower their tone. And sometimes, among all those small sounds, one may sense a deeper layer of silence settling over the place, a kind of silence not born from the absence of people, but from the overwhelming presence of form. Everything in the Tuileries seems always to be required to behave. If one steps farther away from the garden and looks toward the roads, the entrances, the adjoining spaces around the palace, one sees a Paris alive in another way. For around a place like the Tuileries, there is always a broad, supporting world. Coachmen must wait. Small vendors may choose to stand just close enough to hope for customers. Messengers come and go. Servants of wealthy families may be sent ahead to prepare things. Those who work for the palace itself pass through in the rhythms of their particular duties. And beyond all of that is the city's larger current, where trade, rumor, politics, and daily life never cease. This is what makes the Tuileries district never merely a beautiful oasis. It is always an intersection, a point where what is highly controlled meets what is always lively and unpredictable in Paris. Perhaps it is in the afternoon that this place reaches its most characteristic form. As the light softens, the garden grows less severe. The shadows of the trees lengthen. The gravel pales. The rows of those strolling seem to move more slowly, as though the last hours of the day permit them to be less bound by purpose. This may be when the Tuileries reveals most clearly its double nature. It is both a space of ceremony and a space of daily rhythm, both a place of form and a place of deeply human habits. People may come here to display a new outfit, to meet someone, to demonstrate what class they belong to gather news, or simply to walk through a part of Paris where beauty has already been arranged for them. A great city does not live by labor and power alone. It also lives by those useless yet necessary stretches of time when people go out merely to feel that they are living with the city itself. And the Tuileries was one of those places. But wherever there are many gazes, there are also many comparisons. The garden and the area around the palace were certainly places where people became acutely aware of how they appeared to others. Who was dressed better? Who was walking with whom? Who could step closer into the more distinguished spaces? Who had to remain at the edge? Who appeared naturally to belong here, and who still moved awkwardly, like a newcomer? This gave the Tuileries a remarkably rich psychological life. It was not merely a physical space, but a space of impression, of status, of very subtle forms of display that every refined society cultivates. Even when no grand conference was taking place, even when no ceremonial procession passed through, the Tuileries remained a place where people quietly read one another from another angle. We should also remember that not everyone who came near the Tuileries saw it with the same feeling. For some, it must have been a symbol of beauty, order, and national grandeur. For others, it may have served as a reminder that there were social distances not easily crossed. For some, it was simply a familiar Parisian place, tied to strolls, to meetings, to rare moments of rest. And for those whose work directly served the life around the palace, the Tuileries must have seemed very practical, a place with much to do, many rules, many eyes, and little room for error. It is precisely this variety in how a place is experienced that gives it greater depth in history. The Tuileries did not carry just one meaning. It carried many meanings at once, depending on which side of the gate one stood, what shoes one wore, and what place one occupied in the social order. At times, the palace also cast its shadow over everything around it in the most literal sense. When the sun shifted, the shadow of that long architectural mass stretched across courtyards and pathways, making those who walked there feel that they were near something greater than themselves. This is a very deep part of the urban experience around power. One does not need to step inside to know that such a place affects one's life. Simply walking through its shadow is enough. And so the Tuileries lived not only in the palace rooms of the court, but in the sensations of those who regularly passed by it, in their familiarity with its facades, its gates, the rhythm of its windows, in the knowledge that here the city operated a little differently, looked a little different, behaved a little differently. Then there were the days when the weather was unkind. Rain darkened the paths. The rows of trees looked more somber. Skirts were lifted higher to avoid the mud. Passing carriages made heavier sounds on the damp ground. And even then, the Tuileries did not lose its sense of presence. On the contrary, on gray days it may have seemed even more Parisian, for Paris is not beautiful only in sunlight. It is beautiful too in the leaden color of low clouds, in cold stone, in wet rows of trees, in empty chairs waiting for someone to sit down. A great palace in a city does not always need to shine. Sometimes it makes its strongest impression simply by standing still, like a mass of memory in stone amid the restless weather of life. As afternoon tilts toward evening, the crowds begin to thin, footsteps become fewer, conversations shorten. Those at work begin putting away what must be put away. Perhaps a few chairs are drawn back into order. Perhaps some gate is being prepared for closing. The last light clings for a moment to the palace windows, then withdraws. And this is a beautiful hour in which to understand the Tuileries as part of living Paris. By day, it is a place full of people to be seen. But when the city quiets, the emptiness around it begins to speak instead. The garden becomes less a place of social exchange and returns to being a geometry of silence. The palace ceases to reflect the crowd and becomes once more a somber mass of stone. Yet the life of Paris around it does not disappear. It merely retreats into the streets, the kitchens, the cafes, the apartments, those places where people tell one another what they have just seen, heard, and thought that day near the Tuileries. Perhaps that is the most important point of this chapter. The Tuileries was not merely a place people came to and left, but a place that entered the city's daily memory. It was present in habit, in roots, in the way people arranged to meet, in the way they said, near the garden, near the palace, over there, as though the entire district had become a point of inward orientation in Paris. A structure truly lives in a city only when it becomes a way for people to orient themselves not only on a map, but emotionally. And the Tuileries achieved exactly that. It was at once destination and backdrop, excuse and mirror, a place through which Paris could see beauty, hierarchy, elegance, and the hidden tensions within itself. And so, if in Chapter 2 we saw the Tuileries as part of the grand vision stretching toward the Louvre, then in Chapter 3 we begin to see something perhaps even more enduring than stone: human habit. Footsteps repeated day after day, walks that seemed small yet stretched across generations, glances exchanged beneath the trees, quiet tasks that kept the place always in motion. It was these things that made the Tuileries more than a symbol imposed from above. It became part of Parisian life from below, from the ground, from the body, from movement, from the deeply human breathing rhythm of the city. And as we close this chapter, what remains in the imagination is perhaps not some great event, but something far softer: a gentle afternoon in the Tuileries garden, orderly rows of trees, pale gravel underfoot, a few occupied chairs, a few empty ones, the sound of carriage wheels in the distance, the soft sweep of skirts, and behind it all the palace standing there, silent, yet never invisible. It looks at Paris. Paris looks back at it. And in that long exchange of gazes, a relationship was formed, deep enough that later, when everything changed, the whole city would feel that it had not merely lost a building, but had lost a part of a rhythm of life once intimately familiar. If, in the previous chapter, the Tuileries appeared as part of the rhythm of Parisian life, a place where people strolled, sat to rest, watched one another, and gradually grew accustomed to the palace's presence as something almost natural within the city, then tonight, we will witness the moment when the meaning of that place changed entirely, not through some small architectural alteration, nor through a change of season in the garden, but through a shift in power, in fear, in the gaze cast upon it. A palace once built to display the stability of monarchy, once facing the Louvre like a declaration of order, now began to take on an altogether different role. It was still a palace. The walls still stood. The windows still reflected the sky of Paris. The gardens still preserved the geometry of their staged beauty. But inside, the atmosphere had changed. From being the place where power resided, the Tuileries gradually became the place where power was held in place. And that is a very great difference, very deep, very sad. For from that moment onward, the palace was no longer merely the king's residence. It became the gilded cage of a regime, slowly losing its ability to control its own fate. To understand that change in meaning, we must lift our eyes away from the leisurely walks in the garden and look outward toward France at the end of the 18th century. It was a kingdom grown weary, not merely because of one failed harvest or one passing crisis, but because too many pressures had piled one upon another: public debt, inequality, a tax system weighing most heavily upon those with the least power, new ideas of liberty and sovereignty spreading among intellectuals, and an increasingly visible resentment among the people toward the distance between real life and the rituals of the court. For many years, Versailles had been the glittering center of French monarchy. But for that very reason, it had increasingly become a symbol of remoteness, a world of ceremony, silk, grand rooms, candlelight, and exquisite ritual, while Paris and much of France were living with very real anxieties about bread, taxes, prices, and justice. At first, the Tuileries was not the center of that crisis. It remained only part of the landscape of power, a place with history, with symbolism, but not yet bearing the same direct weight as Versailles. And yet history sometimes needs only a few months to alter the meaning of a place completely. The upheavals of 1789 did precisely that. From the calling of the États Généraux, to the formation of the National Constituent Assembly, to the fall of the Bastille, France entered a state in which power could no longer hide behind ritual alone. It was called out, questioned, challenged, drawn into a new political space that even the king could no longer understand or control according to old habits. And then, in October of that year, an important event took place. The people, especially the women of Paris, marched to Versailles. It was not merely a movement of the crowd. It was the shifting of history's center of gravity. From that moment onward, the distance between court and capital could no longer be allowed to remain intact. Try to imagine the day the royal family left Versailles to return to Paris. It was not a return in glory, nor a triumphant procession. It resembled a pressured homecoming, one in which the outer appearance of royalty still remained, but the spirit of it had changed entirely. The carriages still rolled, flags may still have flown, courtiers were still there around them, but the air no longer carried the atmosphere of choice. This was no longer the calm decision of a court wishing to move its residents for preference or symbolic strategy. This was history's coercion. The king, the queen, and their family were brought from Versailles back to Paris, and the place chosen for them to live was the Tuileries. From that point on, the palace no longer merely received those who had once belonged to the summit of power. It received them in the posture of people who were no longer fully free. From that moment, the soul of the Tuileries changed entirely. On the outside, it was still beautiful enough to be a palace. Its long facades, its rows of windows, its great rooms, its pathways, its stairways, its gardens, all of it could still evoke the feeling of an older order. But that very beauty began to carry a more bitter meaning. The more splendid it was, the more it resembled a cage crafted with too much skill. The larger it was, the more it highlighted the truth that those inside it could no longer truly go where they wished. The more doors, gates, corridors, and rooms it had, the more it reminded one that every movement was now watched, limited, surrounded by the gaze of a city that had changed. This is one of the saddest paradoxes in the history of palaces. The place built to protect monarchy from the roughness of ordinary life ultimately became the place that exposed monarchy's helplessness before the eyes of the people. From within the Tuileries, Paris must have appeared very different from the way it looked from Versailles. Versailles had distance. It had buffers of space. It had lakes, broad gardens, long axes, and a discipline of space that made the king the unquestioned center of the world around him. The Tuileries, by contrast, lay within the city itself. It breathed with Paris, heard Paris, endured Paris. The sounds of the capital could not be pushed far away. Rumors, petitions, unrest in the streets, unfamiliar faces, gathering footsteps, all of it was closer. Too close. If Versailles was a stage upon which monarchy wrote its own script, then the Tuileries was the place where the king was forced to perform before an audience he no longer controlled. And that is what made it a cage, not because iron bars were visible, but because the safe distance had vanished. We may imagine the royal family's first days at the Tuileries as carrying an awkwardness difficult to describe. The rooms still had to be prepared. The spaces had to be adjusted for a court that had arrived far too hastily for the dignity it had once known. The daily rituals were perhaps still maintained as best they could, like a desperate attempt to cling to old forms. Servants still moved about. Meals were still served. Audiences might still take place. But behind all of that lay the feeling that court life was no longer wrapped in certainty. In the corridors, in the private chambers, in those evenings when the sound of the city drifted faintly inward, there must already have been a vague unease, something that Versailles had once been able to soften beneath its splendor. But here, in the heart of Paris, that unease lay nearer, more vivid, impossible to conceal completely beneath ritual. If one stepped out into the garden in those days, one would likely have felt a change in the air there as well. The same rows of trees, the same gravel, the same patch of sky, and yet everything now seemed more carefully watched. The glances were no longer wholly the glances of carefree strollers. There was scrutiny, curiosity, and a new tension between palace and city, because with the royal family at the Tuileries, the place was no longer merely a distant symbol. It had become the object of political attention. Every decision, every movement, every sign from the king was interpreted. The palace, therefore, ceased to be a neutral backdrop to the rhythm of Parisian life. It became a nerve center, a place where every closing door might give birth to rumor, and every figure appearing on a balcony or in a corridor might be read as a signal. Among the things that tightened that cage more than anything else, perhaps none was clearer than the altered nature of residence itself. A person may live in a palace and yet not truly dwell there as its master. That was the condition of the royal family at the Tuileries. They had rooms, they had furnishings, they had ritual, but their power to decide freely over that space had weakened immensely. In the midst of a revolutionized city, the king could no longer regard the Tuileries as an absolute refuge. The new political forces, the assembly, the Parisian public, the press, the political clubs, the gatherings in the streets, all of them took part in defining the meaning of the palace more than the people who lived inside it did. A painful paradox emerged. The deeper the king remained inside the palace, the more he appeared trapped within the symbol of his own power. And then, within that very cage, the idea of escape began to grow. That, too, is deeply human. Once the space that once protected you begins to resemble the place that imprisons you, every route takes on a new meaning. A corridor is no longer merely a corridor. A doorway is no longer merely a doorway. Maps of roads, city gates, relay stations, the distance to the frontier, all of these can begin to rise in the mind as lines of escape. The later failed flight to Varennes was not merely a major political event. It was also the clearest proof that the Tuileries had truly become the soft prison of monarchy. For only when a place is no longer regarded as home does one seek to flee it in that way. And when such a departure fails, the feeling of being held only deepens. By then, the cage closes not only with stone and guards, but with the collapse of the belief that there is still some honorable path of escape. But even before that event, the Tuileries had already begun to gather a heavy silence of its own. No longer the elegant silence of orderly gardens, but the silence of rooms where people spoke more softly because they were no longer sure whom to trust. Of evenings where candlelight might still shimmer on fine wood and precious fabrics, yet could not dispel the feeling of anxiety. Of doors closing while outside there still remained an entire city thinking about them. Perhaps Marie Antoinette still tried to preserve her dignity. Perhaps Louis XVI still tried to play the role of a king cooperating with the new constitutional order. But history is rarely merciful to performances the audience has already seen through. At the Tuileries, every attempt to preserve the old forms only revealed more clearly that their foundations were rotting away. Imagine an evening in the palace. Outside, Paris has gone dark. The wind may be skimming through the garden, making the treetops tremble very softly. Somewhere in the city, there are still the sounds of wheels, voices, footsteps on stone. Inside, candlelight casts shadows upon the walls. Heavy curtains, upholstered chairs, carved tables, tall window frames, all of it still tells the story of an old world trying to preserve its dignity. And yet within that very scene, what we feel most strongly is fragility. A fragility not born of material. The palace still stands firm. The furnishings are still beautiful, but born of the fact that none of these things any longer means power. They are only the shell of power now. The beauty of a regime is not enough to save it once belief has departed. It must also be remembered that this cage did not imprison only the people within it. It imprisoned their image before the public as well. The king and queen at the Tuileries became figures under constant observation. Every action could be judged. Every hesitation could be read as conspiracy. Every stiff gesture could be read as arrogance, while every softened one could be read as weakness. Nearness to the people did not make monarchy closer to the people. On the contrary, it made the distance between them appear sharper still, like a painting hung too close to the viewer's eye. The Tuileries, therefore, was not only the place where the royal family was limited geographically, it was the place where they were held fast within a role that could no longer be salvaged. Perhaps the most painful thing of all was that the palace continued doing its old work even after its meaning had changed. It still had rooms intended for ceremony. It still had approaches meant for formal audiences. It still had gates through which people entered according to rank. It still carried the outward appearance of something built to speak of the durability of monarchy. But now each of those details became a kind of reversed reminder. That durability was gone, that order was no longer believed in, and the corridors, once designed to heighten solemnity, now only made the life of surveillance feel longer and more constricted in a spiritual sense. This is the singular tragedy of the Tuileries in this period. The palace did not collapse at the same time as monarchy. It remained standing long enough to expose monarchy's disintegration from within. If by day the Tuileries was a place of political scrutiny, then by night it may have become most like a cage of all. At night, the space of a palace is meant to offer safety, privacy, protection from the outer world. But for the royal family at the Tuileries, night could no longer bring that full comfort, because the city was too close, because anxieties were too close, because the future no longer possessed a clear shape. A cage does not always need to make noise in order to be frightening. Sometimes its silence is what makes one understand that one is being held. There must have been nights when a small sound in the courtyard, a footstep quicker than usual, a whisper outside the door, was enough to alter the atmosphere inside the room. When power grows afraid, even the most beautiful spaces become cold. And then, as time went on, the cage tightened in the historical sense as well. The relationship between palace and people was no longer the mild tension of a city living near power, but a confrontation taking shape. The Tuileries was no longer seen merely as the king's residence. It was seen as the container of a regime many wished to destroy, or at the very least to force into complete submission before the new order. That gave each passing day in the palace the feeling of waiting for something inevitable. Sooner or later, a door would be forced more violently. Sooner or later, a crowd would draw nearer. Sooner or later, a symbol would be tested not only by argument, but by violence. And yet tonight we stop before the cries and gunfire truly tear this place apart. We stop at the moment when tragedy has already taken shape, but has not yet fully erupted. When the palace has already become a cage, but the cage itself still stands intact. It is a very particular moment in history, the moment when form remains whole, but meaning has broken. The Tuileries is still beautiful, perhaps, to some eyes. It is even more beautiful for carrying such sorrow. But its beauty is no longer the beauty of confident power. It is the beauty of a world being held in place before it collapses. The corridors, the stairways, the window frames, the rows of trees outside in the garden, all of them seem to know more than they can say. They stand there witnessing people born to live amid ritual, now learning how to live amid suspicion. Witnessing a dynasty that once thought itself established by the will of God, now forced to face very earthly demands from its own people. And so, if in the earlier chapters the Tuileries was built from earth, from vision, and then from the rhythm of Parisian life. Then in this chapter, another layer is added to it, the psychological layer of confinement. Not confinement by visible chains, but by scrutiny, by circumstance, by loss of control, and by the fact that power could no longer leave the stage without losing the name by which it had ruled. The palace facing the Louvre, the palace with beautiful gardens and ceremonial paths, was no longer the active space of monarchy. It had become the place where monarchy was held in place for all of France to behold. And as we close this chapter, what lingers in the imagination is not the roar of crowds, not yet fire, not yet final collapse, but something far quieter, candlelight in one great room of the Tuileries. Beyond the windows, the darkness of Paris, and within the room people still clothed in the garments of power, yet no longer able to wear the feeling of certainty that once belonged to them. The palace is still beautiful. The garden is still there. The city still breathes outside. But from now on, the Tuileries is no longer merely a palace. It has become the cage of monarchy, and once history has named a place such as that, it is very rare that its walls retain peace for long. After we have passed through the Tuileries as the cage of a weakening monarchy, we might imagine that its natural fate would be to collapse along with the old world itself, that a palace which had once confined a king during the final days of monarchy would gradually become an uncomfortable remnant, a block of memory that the new age would prefer to avoid rather than preserve. But Paris is rarely so simple, and power, in every age, rarely abandons a beautiful stage merely because the old script has ended. More often, something else happens. That stage is kept, wiped clean, repaired, relit, recast, and then a new performance begins upon the very boards of the old one. The Tuileries entered the Napoleonic age in just such a way. It was no longer the palace of Bourbon monarchy in its old meaning. Yet, it remained too important, too beautiful, too perfectly placed within Paris to be left behind. And so the place that had once stood as a symbol of confinement and crisis was entered by another man, one who saw in it not only the past, but also a perfect instrument for reinventing power. Perhaps that was what Napoleon did best, not merely winning battles, not merely organizing the state, not merely rising from the wreckage of revolution and chaos, but also knowing how to look at old symbols with a gaze at once profoundly practical and piercingly sharp. He understood that post-revolutionary France could not simply return intact to the old languages of monarchy, yet neither could it live forever in a condition sustained only by slogans, violence, and negation. A regime that seeks durability needs more than military victory. It needs form. It needs ritual. It needs presence. It needs spaces that know how to make people feel that power is something visible, ordered, beautiful, weighty, and almost fated. At that point, the Tuileries became priceless. It was not merely a residence. It was a block of history standing in the middle of Paris, directly on the city's visual axis, close enough to the memory of monarchy to suggest continuity, yet flexible enough to be rewritten in a new language. Imagine the moment when the Tuileries began to be seen through the eyes of Napoleon's regime. The corridors, the grand rooms, the stairways, the gardens, all of it remained there. Yet their meaning was no longer sealed within the frame of a lost dynasty. They were like an architectural skeleton waiting to be clothed in new skin. And what is striking is that this new skin was not a complete denial of the past. On the contrary, it was an act of remarkably subtle appropriation. Napoleon did not erase every trace of the old world simply to prove that he was new. He did something far more refined. He took the very languages of monarchy, ritual, space, furniture, visual axes, escorts, formal audiences, the theatrical staging of power, and reorganized them under the name of a new empire. Not in order to become a king in the old sense, but to rise above that memory and stand as a different form of power, more modern in the way it had come into being, yet more classical in the way it staged itself. And so the Tuileries entered a new chapter, not with the sound of collapse, but with a change of tone. If, in the previous chapter, the rooms of the palace seemed steeped in anxiety, in candlelit unease, in the feeling of being watched by a city that no longer believed in it. Now that atmosphere changed. Power returned to this place. But not like an old figure restored, rather like a new character who understood very clearly the effect of every doorway, every stair, every courtyard for Napoleon. The Tuileries was not merely a place to live, it was the center of presence, the place where power could be staged so that France and all of Europe would be compelled to look upon it and understand that a new form of rule had truly replaced the old. What must be remembered is that France in the early 19th century had not yet escaped the long shadow of the Revolution. The memories of crisis, execution, division, and the instability of institutions were still painfully near. For that reason, the recreation of ritual was not some superficial luxury. It was a profound political act. Ritual tells people that order has returned. The repetition of gestures, of dress, of movement, of audiences, processions, rooms arranged by rank, all of it has an effect almost like a sedative upon the state. It makes power appear steadier, longer lasting, more inevitable. In chaos, people tend to cling to symbols, and Napoleon understood that almost instinctively. That is why, when the Tuileries was revived as a palace of empire, it was not only revived materially, it was revived as a machine for producing the feeling of legitimacy. One may imagine the first days of this remaking as labor at once physical and imaginative. Furnishings were changed, rooms were restored, things too closely bound to the previous dynasty were removed or reinterpreted. New interiors appeared, bearing the spirit of the empire style, strong, balanced, luxurious without softness, filled with forms recalling ancient Rome, laurel wreaths, eagles, symbols of victory and empire. Even in decoration, the new regime wanted to say that it was not merely continuing France, it was raising France to another plane, placing it within a greater story of glory, order, military achievement, and historical destiny. And within those rooms, the Tuileries ceased to be the cage of a beleaguered king. It became the backdrop of a man who wished to be seen as the embodiment of a reborn state. But the most important thing lay not in the objects, but in the rhythm of the palace. For a place truly changes its meaning only when the way it is used changes. Under Napoleon, the Tuileries gradually recovered the rhythm of formal receptions. Orderly comings and goings, carefully calculated rituals of appearance. A staircase was no longer merely for ascending. It became a place that slowed the footsteps of power. A door was no longer merely there to open. It created the moment of waiting before the most important figure appeared. a courtyard was no longer simply an empty space. It was where the guard, the carriage train, the banners, the uniforms, and the sound of hooves could be arranged into a vivid living picture. Napoleon did not invent these things out of nothing, but he assembled them with full awareness. France needed to see power at work, walking, seated upon the throne, receiving guests, giving commands, occupying old space and making it serve a new age. Perhaps that is why the Carousel area, before the Tuileries, carried such particular significance in this period. An open space before a palace is always the place where power meets the public in a controlled way. It is a threshold between inside and outside, between court ritual and the city, between the ruler and the collective gaze. Under Napoleon, that space was not neglected in the least. On the contrary, it was elevated into an important part of the new language of power. It was where processions passed, where military presence accompanied political presence, where victory on the battlefield could be translated into urban image. An empire does not rule by documents alone. It rules by spectacles that the people and foreign diplomats cannot forget. And then came the Arc du Carrousel, a small triumphal arch bearing immense significance, like a stone accent that sealed the entire idea. When this monument was raised in the early 19th century, it did not merely beautify the space before the Tuileries. It framed the way the empire wished to be seen. There, military victory, Roman memory, imperial symbolism, and the splendor of ritual came together in an architectural form of remarkable concentration. A triumphal arch always speaks plainly. Someone has triumphed, has returned, has deserved to pass beneath this vault as one confirmed by history. Its placement beside the Tuileries was no accident. It made the palace not merely the residence of power, but the destination of victory. The place where achievements won on the battlefield were transformed into the majesty of the state. Try to imagine a great ceremonial day under Napoleon. By morning, the area around the Tuileries already looks wholly different from an ordinary day. Everything has been carefully prepared. The guard stands in the proper positions. Flags ripple in the light wind. Military uniforms gleam beneath the sun. Carriages, war horses, servants, officials, officers, all are present like elements of a score already written inside the palace. The rooms wait for the moment of appearance. Outside in the court, the public gathers at a distance close enough to see, yet far enough to understand that they do not enter the center. And then, when the ceremony begins, what is being displayed is not merely wealth or habitual luxury. What is being displayed is order. Every footstep, every position, every movement says that this power knows who it is, what it wants, and deserves to be seen as something inevitable. But here too we should slow down in order to see more clearly the true nature of that reinvention. Napoleon did not simply repeat the Bourbon court. Had he done that, he would have become no more than a belated copy of the old world. What he did instead was to borrow the visual instruments of monarchy and pour into them a different story. In that story, the source of power came not only from blood, it came from talent, victory, the ability to impose order after chaos, and the ability to compel France and Europe alike to recognize him. That is why Napoleonic ritual appears at once deeply classical and yet charged with new energy. It is not the ritual of peaceful inheritance, but the ritual of conquest that has been institutionalized It does not merely say, "I am the rightful heir." It also says, "I seized this place by strength, and now I will make it seem as though it had always been waiting for me." That made the Tuileries a place of exceptional dramatic richness, for within the same corridor, one could feel the shadows of many ages layered upon one another. The shadow of the old monarchy, the shadow of revolutionary anxiety, the shadow of footsteps that had once lived within a political cage, and now, over that foundation, the new empire with its symbols of victory, its military echoes, its harder, more decisive tone. A palace like that never wholly forgets what it has been. Perhaps that is why the new power so urgently wished to cover it in ritual, to make the present layer so strong that the older memory could no longer overpower the feeling of the new embodiment of the state. Nor should we forget that behind ritual lies private life. And at the Tuileries under Napoleon, that private life also contributed to the story of power. Private chambers, salons, specially commissioned furnishings, chairs, curtains, carefully selected objects, all of it created the feeling that the empire existed not only in battlefields and state papers, but seeped into every surface of daily life. Josephine, and later Marie-Louise, family relationships, networks of courtiers, intimate meetings, all of it introduced the warmth of human presence into the grandeur of the palace. But that humanity did not diminish the theatrical nature of the place. On the contrary, it completed it. For power is strongest only when it makes both private life and public life reflect the same symbolic language. If, on a quieter afternoon, not a day of grand ceremony, one were to pass through the Tuileries in the imperial age, the feeling would perhaps differ from the swelling intensity of great ritual, yet the sense of control would remain unmistakable. Those at work move quickly and properly. The guards are present like iron punctuation marks in the landscape. The rooms inside, though not full of people, still seem to be awaiting orders, awaiting the arrival of something important. The garden behind is no longer merely a place for walking. It is the gentler part of the same body of power. And the whole palace, from exterior to interior, from courtyard to corridor, from stairway to salon, emits a strikingly consistent message. Chaos has passed. The center has returned. The stage has a new master. But like every stage, that certainty also contains within it a constant need to be sustained. Ritual is not something that need only be performed once. It must be repeated, maintained. It must continually recreate the feeling it wishes to produce. That gave the Tuileries under Napoleon an energy that almost never allowed it to relax. A palace of empire had to be perpetually ready to become an image. Any day might be a day of diplomacy, an audience, an announcement, a military review, a reception, a triumphal return. And in that rhythm of repetition, power did not merely reside within the palace, it consumed the palace, using it as a living instrument with which to write and rewrite the same assertion of itself. There is something both powerful and fragile in that. Powerful, because one can feel so clearly Napoleon's gift for understanding that symbols are not things to be taken lightly. An empire that wishes to be believed must know how to look like an empire, and yet fragile, because any power that depends too much on performance is always dependent upon its ability to go on directing the stage. Still, that fragility belongs to the future, at the point where we now stand. the Tuileries had truly been revived. No longer the cage of a dying monarchy. It had become the center of a state, presenting itself as the only force capable of gathering France back into wholeness. That palace no longer asked people to believe in it through bloodline, but through image, through ritual rhythm, through victory, through overwhelming presence, at night. Napoleon's Tuileries must have possessed a very particular beauty, no longer the anxious darkness of the years of confinement, but a darkness lit by deliberate order. Candlelight or lamplight in the great salons must have fallen across gilded surfaces, polished materials, uniforms, silks, and faces living with the awareness that they belonged to the center of a Europe in transformation. Outside, Paris remained Paris, with its streets, its people, its daily sounds. But here, within the palace, everything was elevated into form. Empire did not sleep the way ordinary people sleep. It rested within its own light. And so, if Chapter 4 was the story of a palace that had preserved its outer appearance while losing its inner freedom, then Chapter 5 is the reverse story, a palace carrying within its stone walls the memory of crisis, yet granted a new life through calculated display. Napoleon did not merely enter the Tuileries. He rewrote it. He transformed it from a space of confinement into a space of assertion. He used ritual to mend the sense of power that the revolution had fractured. He turned courtyard, corridor, archway, furnishing, and courtly rhythm into the language of a new state, modern in its origins, yet classical in the way it sought to immortalize itself. And when we close this chapter, the image that remains in the mind is perhaps a very clear one. The Tuileries under the light of empire, the carousel before it, Paris beyond, and in between them a stage of power newly rebuilt from what history had seemed to break apart. The same walls, the same gardens, but a different soul. No longer the fear of being held in place, no longer the confusion of power dissolving. Now there is confidence, carefully directed, majesty, arranged down to the smallest detail, and a message sounding through every footstep, every ritual, every triumphal arch, every doorway opening wide. France has a new master, and that new master understands that to govern a people who once overthrew a throne, one must first learn how to make the throne appear indispensable once again. The Tuileries occupied a very particular place. It was no longer merely the center of ceremony within the confines of the court, but had become part of a new Paris, broader, brighter, straighter, more dazzling, and also more tightly controlled. If before, power had used the palace as an instrument with which to impress, now, under the Second Empire, power seemed to want the whole city to participate in that act. The Tuileries stood there, between the Louvre, the garden, the carousel, the new boulevards, and the streams of people pouring in, like a heart still beating within an urban body that was changing its shape. Paris, in the middle of the 19th century, was no longer the Paris that had witnessed the first convulsions of revolution, nor was it still the Paris of the early empire. With the urgency of a new power that needed to establish itself, it entered the age of Napoleon III with a different rhythm, the rhythm of presentation. Not because instability had completely disappeared, but because the state understood that, in order to survive in a new age, power needed not only to be strong, but also to appear magnificent, effective, and modern. And here, modern did not simply mean new. It meant the ability to organize the movement of people, of traffic, of goods, of the gaze, and of the collective imagination itself. A modern city is one that knows how to overwhelm people while still making them feel that everything is in order. That is what made Paris under the Second Empire so distinctive. It was at once a place to live, to trade, to govern, and an urban stage directed on an unprecedented scale. Within that setting, the Tuileries was by no means pushed into the background as a relic of the past. On the contrary, it was placed at the center of a new ecosystem of power. Napoleon III and the makers of his Paris did not see the palace as an object standing alone, but as one link in an entire language of display that was now being extended across the whole city. A great palace cannot fully exercise its symbolic force if all around it remain cramped. Chaotic, hard-to-reach spaces lacking clear axes of vision. Just as an actor cannot stand out if the stage is too dark and the backdrop poorly tended. The Tuileries in this period benefited from the fact that all of Paris was being transformed into a visual frame favorable to power. Wider openings, straighter roads, more unified facades, better controlled movement. All of it made the palace no longer merely the place where power resided, but the place where power could be seen as a natural part of urban order. One can imagine a morning in the Tuileries district under the Second Empire and feel the difference at once. The air seems cleaner, more open than in the cramped old Paris of earlier narrow streets. The new axes of the city allow light to travel farther inward. The sound of vehicles is still there, but their flow seems to have more direction. The orderly facades create the impression that the city has learned how to stand upright, and in the midst of it all, the Tuileries appears not as a structure struggling against a changing city, but as a center upheld by that very change. The garden behind it still preserves the softness of landscape. The Louvre still stands with its historical massiveness. Yet now the entire area bears a different character, less accidental, less jagged, and more deeply marked by the feeling that each expanse of space has been thought of as part of a larger image. This is also the moment when we must look more closely at the relationship between the Tuileries and the Louvre during this period. If before they had faced one another like two chapters of power, then under the Second Empire, that relationship was reinforced through an ambition for completion and synchronization. The Louvre was no longer merely a repository of older historical layers. It was intensified as part of the face of empire. Its wings, its courtyards, its facades, its interiors, all took part in making this district a center that bore both the depth of monarchy and the energy of a modernizing France. The Tuileries, standing beside it, became the emperor's residence, the place where political life and the life of spectacle met. When one looked upon the entire complex from a distance, one no longer saw only a palace and a future museum. One saw something larger, an idea of France framed in stone, landscape, ritual, and historical depth. In this story, architecture does not tell the whole tale by itself. What truly made the Tuileries the center of performing Paris was the way it was used as a source from which ritual, activity, appearance, and impression radiated outward. A great palace in peacetime has never been merely a place to live. It is a place where ambassadors are received, where banquets are held, where honored guests are welcomed, where carriage processions begin, where signals are sent that the nation is prosperous, confident, and fully capable of turning its own power into spectacle. Perhaps under the Second Empire, this reached an especially visible intensity. Display was no longer a secondary thing. It became part of the very art of governing, a state that wants its people, and Europe itself. To believe in its stability must appear as if it has no doubt in that stability at all. And there was no place more fitting than the Tuileries to make that happen. Imagine a day of grand ceremony. Gleaming carriages roll along roads that have been broadened. Wheels no longer struggle to squeeze through over-tight narrow lanes as they once did in old Paris. The escort has room to reveal itself in the full order of its form. Spectators have space to pause, to look up, to talk, to marvel. Uniforms, gowns, flags, insignia, the sound of hooves, the sound of wheels, reflections on glass and metal, all merge into a vivid picture. And then, in the end, every line of sight seems to lead toward one point, the Tuileries district. In such moments, the palace is not merely the place where the procession arrives. It resembles the natural conclusion of an entire urban movement. The city itself seems to have been arranged so that power may pass through it and end at a point sufficiently magnificent to affirm itself. That is why Paris in this period cannot be separated from the concept of spectacle. But spectacle here should not be understood in a frivolous sense. It is not merely surface luxury. It is the organization of impression as an instrument of power. A new boulevard does not merely make traffic more convenient. It allows power to move and appear on a larger scale. A unified facade does not merely beautify a street. It makes the city appear as though it has been brought under a single strong will. An open square does not merely create empty space. It allows the crowd to gather and at the same time allows the state to see the crowd. Spectacle, therefore, always travels together with control. And it is here that this chapter deepens. The beauty of Second Empire Paris does not arise from aesthetics alone. It arises from the use of aesthetics to manage space, the body, and the gaze. The Tuileries stood at the heart of that very contradiction. It was more beautiful when placed within a Paris that had been straightened, widened, and polished. But it was also more tightly bound than ever to the will of the state to turn the city into a surface that was legible, presentable, and easy to control. If one stood in the Tuileries garden on an afternoon and looked out toward the city, one could feel the seduction of that age as something entirely real. The paths are cleaner. The rows of trees still preserve their old order, yet now they speak with a city shedding and renewing its skin. The strollers themselves are perhaps different too, more numerous, more varied, and living in a city beginning to understand with greater clarity that it is the capital of modernity, of fashion, of national ritual, and of the gaze of the outside world. But at the same time, beneath the softness of those afternoon walks, there remains something harder. The feeling that everything has been calculated so that people might be both enchanted and shaped. Perhaps that is why life around the Tuileries during the Second Empire carried such a particular rhythm. It was no longer simply the rhythm of the court, nor the rhythm of revolution, but the rhythm of urbanization under direction. People still strolled, still sat in the garden chairs, still talked, still watched one another. But now they did so within a city designed so that those motions themselves became part of a larger picture. A well-dressed lady passing through the Tuileries was no longer merely an individual walking. She was a stroke of color within a Paris of spectacle. An officer crossing the carousel was no longer simply performing a duty. He was part of the image of empire. A family standing to watch a procession was not merely observing. They were being drawn into the ritual of looking, the ritual of acknowledgement, the ritual of becoming the audience of power. This is not always consciously perceived, yet it settles into daily life like a kind of weather. In spiritual terms as well, this was a period in which the Tuileries became especially rich in magnificence. If under Napoleon, the first ritual had still borne the sharp edge of military triumph and the re-establishment of order after chaos, under Napoleon III, it became softer on the surface, more polished, more urban in character. This was a form of power that wished to be admired not only through fear or martial glory, but through the feeling that it represented civilization, comfort, beauty, and progress. The Tuileries, with its reception rooms, its interiors, its ceremonies, its welcomes, became the place where a power skilled in seduction was performed. It did not always need to shout its strength. Sometimes it was enough for the light to fall upon the right surfaces, for the carriage procession to arrive on time, for the banquet to unfold without the slightest flaw, for international guests to depart with the feeling that Paris was the very heart of modern Europe. An empire is sometimes strongest when it makes beauty appear to be the natural evidence of politics itself. And yet, like all beauty that is too carefully staged, the Paris of spectacle carried within it a quiet fragility. When a city is built too forcefully to appear beautiful and orderly, one begins to ask what has been pushed back behind those facades. Which older neighborhoods have disappeared, which communities have been displaced, which ways of life have been cut through, which resentments have been softened by new light, new stone, and new boulevards, but have not vanished at all. Of course, standing in the Tuileries district, one is easily swept away by the splendor and forgets such things, but history has a very long memory, and sometimes the cities most beautifully presented are also the ones carrying the greatest pressures beneath the surface. Even so, in this chapter, we have not yet entered that fracture. We are still standing in the moment when the performance has reached maturity, when Paris seems to have succeeded in transforming itself into a capital at once ancient and new, ritualized and practical, powerful and graceful. If one were to enter the Tuileries on an evening in this period, the feeling would likely be wholly different from the heavy darkness of Chapter 4 or the taut light of Chapter 5. This is the light of urban confidence. From the salons there may spread a warm glow reflected in mirrors, gilding, gowns, and glass. Outside, the city no longer sinks fully into darkness as it once did. A more modern Paris knows how to extend the evening through illumination, activity, and social rhythm, and the Tuileries, in the midst of it all, seems no longer merely a palace, but a luminous core, a place where one feels oneself to be at the center not only of France, but of an entire idea of Europe as civilized, dazzling, and exquisitely arranged. Yet what makes this chapter special is the fact that the Tuileries never wholly lost the memory of earlier ages. No matter how polished its exterior became, its stone still held older layers of history within it. It had once been a structure born from the dream of Catherine de' Medici, once part of the world of monarchy, once the cage of a dynasty held in place. once the place where Napoleon I reinvented the language of power, and now, under the Second Empire, it had once again become the center of a larger Paris, planned like a national stage. Perhaps it is precisely that layering which makes the Tuileries so compelling in the imagination. It never lived in only one time. It was continually rewritten, yet never entirely cleared of the older lines written across it. And when a structure carrying so much history is placed at the center of a city, performing its own modernity, the result is always both splendid and haunting. Try to hold in your mind one image: a late afternoon, pale sunlight falling across the Tuileries garden, the long, disciplined rows of trees, the carousel before it, and farther off the new roads of Paris carrying light and movement through the city in a way they never had before. Carriages glide by, strollers speak softly. A group of officials may just have passed. A foreign guest may just have lifted his eyes to the palace facade and thought, "This is the very shape of modern power." In that moment, everything seems to function so smoothly that one is tempted to believe such order will last forever. But history, as we have already sensed many times along this journey, rarely favors stages that appear too perfect. And so, if Chapter 5 was the story of reinventing ritual inside the palace, then Chapter 6 is the story of extending that ritual out across the whole city. The Tuileries no longer stands merely as a solitary center of power. It is placed within a Paris being arranged so that the city itself becomes an extension of the palace. Power appears not only on the steps, in the salons, or in the escort processions. It appears in the boulevards, in the lines of sight, in the regular facades, in the feeling that the whole capital has learned how to present itself as proof of the regime ruling it. This is the Paris of spectacle, but also the Paris of control, of aesthetics serving politics, of beauty mobilized to make power appear at once natural and unavoidable. And as we close this chapter, what lingers is perhaps a strange but very soft feeling, the feeling of standing in a city so beautiful it almost seems unreal, where everything, from the rows of trees, the paths, the facades, the processions, the garden, to the Tuileries Palace itself, appears to have been adjusted into its proper place within one great composition. Paris at that moment is not merely living. Paris is performing itself, and at the very center of that performance, the Tuileries stands there, splendid, confident, upheld by an entire city that has learned how to become a stage for power. But like every stage built too beautifully, it is also silently drawing closer to the moment when the lights will change color, and what once appeared unshakable will begin to tremble in the dark. If in the previous chapter we were still standing amid a Paris of light, of boulevards, of orderly facades, and of a power that knew how to turn the entire city into a stage for itself, then tonight that stage will change color, not all at once, not in a single instant when the flames erupt and everything collapses in the sound of explosions. The great events of history almost never begin at the exact minute later generations tend to remember. More often, they begin earlier, in defeats, humiliations, hunger, accumulated anger, and political wills that no longer wish to live side by side. And with the Tuileries, the fire of 1871 must be understood in that way as well. It was not merely a fire, it was the final result of a city driven to the edge, of a France that had just lost a war, of a Paris besieged, wounded, starving, divided, and at last turning the very symbols of its own power into targets, to arrive at that night of fire. We must first feel the atmosphere of Paris after the Franco-Prussian War. The polished confidence of the Second Empire had been deeply cracked. The boulevards were still there. The facades were still standing. The Tuileries garden still kept its disciplined rows of trees, but beneath that layer of stone, belief had changed. Military defeat changes the way a city sees itself. A capital once presented as the center of civilization and power now had to taste siege, hunger, humiliation, and the forced recognition that beauty and ritual could not protect it from artillery, from loss, from the collapse of a regime. And when those foundations begin to tremble, symbols begin to tremble with them. And so, the Tuileries, though still standing upright in the middle of Paris, no longer appeared merely as a beautiful palace. It bore upon itself the memory of dynasties, empires, performances of power, and for that very reason, it also began to take on the character of a target. The Paris of the spring of 1871 was no longer the Paris of leisurely walks in the garden. It was a city living in tension, in suspicion, in political boundaries growing harder and harder. The Paris Commune was born in that setting, not as an isolated burst of impulse, but as the crystallization of grievances, ideals, anger, and despair. When a city feels abandoned, betrayed, forced to carry the humiliation of the nation, it very easily returns to the oldest of questions. Who built this order? And which of its symbols must now be erased? The Tuileries stood there like an answer too clear to miss. It had once been the palace of monarchy. It had once been the stage of empire. It had once been the center of ritual, hierarchy, distance, grandeur, and display. For those who wanted to sever themselves completely from that past. Not every building in Paris bore the same weight. Some buildings were only stone. Others were ideas built in stone. The Tuileries belonged to the second kind. Try to imagine the city in those days. On the surface, it was still familiar, Paris, roads, bridges, squares, rows of trees, but the air had entirely changed. There were defensive positions, makeshift barricades, footsteps that moved more quickly, arguments that no longer ended in politeness. Windows may still have opened onto the street, but behind them were families living in anxiety. Some believed in the ideals of the commune. Some feared it. Some despaired. Some hated. Some wanted only to make it through the day without losing another loved one. In such a Paris, buildings were no longer merely scenery. They were drawn into the conflict. They were forced to carry meaning. And the Tuileries, with all its long history, gradually entered that zone of danger as a symbol that could no longer remain neutral. Perhaps in the final days of the Commune, as the forces of Versailles drew closer, the feeling of compression within the city must have been immense. People knew that an ending was coming, but no one could still be certain in what form it would arrive. In such moments, when defeat or repression is at hand, history often moves toward two extreme reactions, either a desperate clinging to what remains, or the destruction of what once represented a world no longer acceptable. The fire of the Commune belonged to the second reaction. It was not, according to the logic of those who carried it out, a meaningless act. It bore a terrible symbolic force. If an old order and its symbols could no longer be seized as tools for the future, Then they could be given over to fire. And then that night came. Imagine the evening around the Tuileries in the final hours before the fire was set. The light over Paris was no longer the composed light of the previous chapter. The city was exhausted. The air seemed heavier, as though it too knew that something was about to happen that could not be taken back. The palace, in the midst of it all, still held on to its great form, its long facade, its steep roofs, its rows of windows, the darkness behind the panes, its steps, its grand rooms inside. All of it still seemed to insist that the Tuileries had survived so many upheavals before. It had witnessed monarchy, revolution, empire, reconstruction, spectacle. A building that has lived that long easily tempts people into the illusion that it is nearly immortal. But fire is always what reminds all architecture that stone, wood, fabric, paint, curtains, ceilings, interiors, corridors, stairways, all of it ultimately belongs to the material world. And the material world can burn. Those preparing to burn the Tuileries surely did not look at the palace the way a stroller might look at it. They did not see centuries of accumulated beauty. They saw symbol. They saw old power. They saw empire. They saw a past they wanted to negate through an act that could not be misunderstood. That is the essential thing to feel in this chapter. The fire was not only meant to destroy material, it was meant to erase a language. A palace like the Tuileries had spoken for power for far too long. And in the fury of urban civil war, to destroy it meant to force it into silence forever. That is the tragedy of symbolic buildings. The more political meaning they carry, the harder they are to spare in extreme moments. Inside the palace, one can imagine the grand rooms once filled with ritual, now holding another kind of silence. No longer the steady sounds of court life, no longer the footsteps of servants preparing an audience, no longer the ceremonies that made a light fall across uniforms, silk and gold instead. There is the feeling of a place about to be betrayed by the very materials that once made its splendor possible. A large palace does not burn as easily as a small house, and yet because its interiors are dense with wood, fabric, decoration, stairways, doors, and ceilings, once fire catches in the right place, it does not burn gently. It burns with all of its material memory, every curtain, every frame, every painted panel, every piece of custom-made furniture accumulated across generations. All of it can become fuel for disappearance. And then the flames rose. At first, perhaps, they were only small, bright points in the dark, places where fire began to eat into flammable material. But fire in a palace never stays in one corner for long. It always finds its way. It climbs wood. It draws itself into curtains. It licks across ceilings. It searches through corridors as though architecture itself were inadvertently teaching it how to move. And before long, rooms that had once contained power began to contain red light. The windows reflected no longer the sky of Paris, but the growing blaze within. Perhaps that was the most terrifying moment for those who witnessed it, when a building still retains its outward shape. Yet, from its windows, fire begins to appear like the soul of destruction itself, speaking aloud. Paris must have watched that spectacle in many different moods. Some saw it as a justified act. Some saw it as catastrophe. Some simply stood still, held fast by the ancient power of fire. For human beings are always hypnotized by the sight of a great building burning. There is something at once horrific and impossible to look away from in seeing an order of stone and wood erased piece by flame, from a distance. People could see the sky above the Tuileries changing color, red light rising into the Paris night, smoke climbing high, the whole area seeming at once real and like some apocalyptic painting. Those who had known the Tuileries through garden walks, ceremonies, carriage processions, and grand occasions now had to look upon it by the final light it ever produced, not the light of imperial chandeliers, but the light of annihilation. Perhaps in those hours of burning, the Tuileries revealed its tragic destiny more completely than at any other moment, because it was not destroyed like an anonymous storehouse. It was burned as a symbol. And that meant the fire did not merely consume rooms one by one. It also burned through the layers of meaning that had clung to the place for 3 centuries. In that fire were the shadows of Catherine de' Medici, of generations of monarchs, of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette in the days they were held there, of Napoleon reinventing ritual, of the Second Empire turning Paris into a stage. Every age seemed to flare up and then sink into the red glow. A building written and rewritten so many times was now being written in a final language, shorter and crueler than all the rest, the language of ash. Imagine the roofs beginning to take the heat, the structures inside groaning under the temperature, the explosions of overstrained material, the breaking glass, the splitting wood, the fire-devouring emptiness, and then climbing higher still. The stone walls may have continued to stand, but inside, everything was turning to charcoal. A palace does not die at once when it burns. It agonizes. It keeps its shape a little longer, as if refusing to believe that it is disappearing. And that is what makes the scene all the more painful. The Tuileries did not instantly collapse as though it had never existed. It burned while still being itself. People could still recognize the facade, still recognize the main masses, still know that what they were looking at was that palace. But the longer it burned, the more unbearable that recognition became. Because with every passing minute, what was familiar lost another part that could never be restored. Perhaps in some corners, the firefighting forces or those trying to stop the blaze were helpless before the scale of destruction. Once fire has mastered great interior spaces and such dense materials, saving a palace ceases to be a matter of individual courage. It becomes a struggle against time, material, wind, the height of ceilings, and a network of connected rooms. And in battles like that, sometimes the only thing that can still be saved is what remains of the stone walls. And so the Tuileries passed through that night like a body from which all breath had been drawn, leaving behind only a skeleton. This is also the moment when we should slow down and feel the full symbolic force of the fire. For in the history of Paris, 1871 was not merely the year a palace burned. It was the year in which the city, in the convulsions of civil war, turned fire against its own symbolic organs. The Hôtel de Ville, other public buildings, many places entered the zone of flame. That means the Tuileries was not the solitary victim of some isolated disaster. It belonged to a moment when Paris seemed to want to burn the very face of power that had ruled it. But because the Tuileries carried such a long history, because it had once been the heart of so many regimes, its burning became an image surpassing all the rest, as though an entire old world were catching fire in the middle of the capital. Perhaps the next day, or the days after, when the smoke had thinned and the flames had quieted enough for people to look more closely, the sight became even more painful than the night of the blaze itself. At night, fire can make everything seem too enchanted, too violent, too overwhelming to fully feel the loss. But the morning after fire is always more merciless. When daylight rises, people begin to see clearly what is gone. Ceilings vanished, windows blackened, rooms hollowed out, scorched walls, heaps of ruin. What had once been imperial interiors now reduced to charcoal, dust, twisted metal, and fragments. At that point, the Tuileries was no longer the palace of ceremony or the stage of power. It was the corpse of an idea. And it must have been in that moment that Paris understood there are losses that cannot be repaired by sweeping quickly or replacing a few doors. A palace like the Tuileries was not made only of walls and roofs. It was made of continuous chains of decoration, composition, objects, atmosphere, ritual, and memory. When fire passed through it, what was lost was not material alone. It was continuity. Once it had burned in that way, even if the walls still stood, the material soul of the palace had been severed. And from that point onward, even if one intended to restore it, the Tuileries could never again be the Tuileries of the day before. It had entered another condition, the condition of ruin. If in the earlier chapters we repeatedly saw the Tuileries being rewritten, reinterpreted, and reused, then this chapter is the first time something else happened. It was forced into silence. Not because people forgot it, but because fire had cut off its ability to continue living fully as a space of power. And perhaps that is why the burning of 1871 remains so haunting. Because it was not merely the end of a building. It was like the moment a city saw its own past being burned before its eyes. A past it loved, hated, took pride in, resisted, yet could not deny had helped to shape it. So, if Chapter 6 was the height of the Tuileries, as part of a splendid and carefully staged Paris, then Chapter 7 is its complete reversal. The stage still remains, but now it is lit by fire. Power is still present, but now as the power of negation. The palace still holds the eye, but no longer because of arranged beauty, rather because destruction is sweeping room by room through it. The Tuileries, a building that had changed roles so many times in the history of France, finally took on its most tragic role of all, becoming the giant torch of a Paris tearing apart its own political memory. And as we close this chapter, what remains in the mind is perhaps an image at once bright and painful, the night sky of Paris turning red above the Tuileries, windows casting out flame, smoke rising high, walls still trying to stand while everything inside turns to charcoal. A palace once built from ambition, expanded by vision, surrounded by urban life, turned into a cage, then into an imperial stage, now ending in the form of the final symbol history granted it, a fire so immense that it burned not only a building, but the illusion itself that the stages of power can live forever without one day being judged by the very city that built them. After that night of fire, what remained was not immediate disappearance, but something far more haunting, the existence of a dead palace that still refused to leave the city. The Tuileries did not collapse entirely in a single moment and immediately give way to emptiness. After the fire of 1871, its interior was devastated, but the stone walls still stood, And it was precisely that continued standing which forced Paris to live for years with a strange spectacle. A palace that was no longer truly a palace, yet remained intact enough in outline to remind every passerby that this place had once been a center of power. The Louvre confirms that after being burned in 1871, the ruins of the Tuileries remained until they were demolished in 1883. Imagine the first morning when the smoke had thinned enough for people to stand at a distance and look more carefully. Paris was still Paris, the sky perhaps pale gray, the gravel still holding a trace of the night's dampness. The Tuileries garden still there, like a final effort of the old order. But at the edge of the garden, where the palace had once stood as a complete mass, there was now only a hollow body. The roofs were gone, the interiors burned, and the rooms that had once received kings, queens, emperors, diplomats, officials, music, light, ceremony, and political whispers had become nothing but black, emptied chambers. This is an image very different from the ruins of war out in open fields. A burned palace in the heart of a capital is not merely material loss. It is memory stripped of all flesh, exposing its skeleton in the middle of the city's daily life. Contemporary photographs and later collections alike emphasize this with striking clarity, the frame of the walls still standing, while the soul inside had been emptied out. And perhaps that is why the years after 1871 carried such a singular atmosphere. Paris had not merely lost the Tuileries, Paris had to live beside the dead Tuileries. In many cities, when a symbolic structure is destroyed, the void is quickly filled by something new, or the wound is softened by building activity. But here, the opposite happened. The ruin stood there for some 11 years, like a refusal to vanish on time. The Louvre states quite clearly that the ruins remained standing until 1883, and Britannica likewise confirms that the palace was burned in 1871 and later dismantled. If one passed through that area in those years, one must have felt something almost unreal. The walls still preserved the rhythm of the old architecture. Some facades remained intact enough for the eye to reconstruct the former shape. Anyone who had known the Tuileries before the fire could hardly fail to compare. Here had once been a corridor, there a grand hall, over there the glow of lights, beyond it a staircase, heavy curtains, painted ceilings, mirrored frames, the salons of empire. But now, in place of those things, there were openings, scorch marks, windows looking into nothingness. Such a structure was no longer merely a heap of rubble. It was a memory with a physical form. And memory, when it takes physical form in the heart of a city, is always more unsettling than memory confined to books. It forces people to choose, to see it as a warning, as an object of mourning, as a symbol of liberation, or as the stain of civil war. Because the walls still stood, a great question quickly emerged. Should the Tuileries be rebuilt? This is a very important point, because many people today tend to assume that once the palace burned, that was the end of it. But in fact, as historical surveys make clear, reconstruction was once considered feasible because so much of the stone shell still survived. Wikipedia, synthesizing historical sources, notes that while the roofs and interiors were destroyed, the stone walls remained relatively intact, making restoration technically conceivable. Of course, it is an open encyclopedia and must therefore be read with caution. Yet it aligns with the broader picture from the Louvre and the visual record. the Tuileries was not instantly flattened. It survived clearly enough to provoke a prolonged debate. And that debate is the true soul of this period, for from 1871 into the early 1880s, Paris stood not only before an architectural question, but before a question of political memory. What would it mean to rebuild the Tuileries? Would it be the recovery of part of historic Paris, or a quiet restoration of a symbol too deeply tied to monarchy and empire? And what would it mean to tear it down? Would that mean accepting that an age had ended, and that the city must move forward without carrying the shell of old power with it? These questions could not be answered through aesthetics alone, because the Tuileries was not merely beautiful or important. It was a structure loaded with too much political meaning across 3 centuries. Each faction could look at the same blackened wall and see something entirely different. In those years, the ruins must have changed with the seasons, and that only made them more haunting. In winter, rain and mist likely made the walls colder, the stone grayer. The empty window openings seemed deeper. In spring, the trees in the neighboring garden still put forth leaves, as though nature had decided to continue, regardless of the architecture of power having just died beside it. On sunny days, the light may have fallen through the openings where roofs and ceilings had once been, making the ruins appear not quite like chaotic wreckage, but like a body cut open so that the city might see its interior. There were perhaps also afternoons when Parisians stood at a distance and said very little, only watched. Because sometimes a building, after death, acquires greater spiritual weight than it ever possessed while alive. When intact, the Tuileries had always been veiled in ritual, power, and distance. As a ruin, it became more legible as a shared tragedy. It should also be remembered that during this period, Paris did not stand still. The city continued to live, to move, to negotiate with its future. And that is precisely why the prolonged survival of the Tuileries ruins was all the more remarkable. It stood in the midst of a Paris trying to recover after civil war and military defeat, as a reminder that the past had not yet been resolved. The Louvre today describes this area as a broad, open esplanade between the wings of the Louvre. But that was only made possible after the ruins were demolished. Before that expanse appeared, Paris had to pass through more than a decade of living with the skeleton of the palace. Then, finally, a decision was made. The sources now available all indicate that in the early 1880s, the government of the Third Republic chose not to restore the Tuileries, but to demolish what remained. Some secondary sources make clear that political arguments dragged on. Then in 1882, demolition was approved, and in 1883, the dismantling was completed. The Louvre confirms the date of 1883 for the removal of the ruins, while Britannica emphasizes that the palace was burned in 1871 and thereafter ceased to exist as a living structure. That decision, if one thinks about it carefully, was an immense one, because demolishing a burned palace is not the same as demolishing an ordinary old building. It is the choice to end the possibility of return. So long as the walls remained standing, there was always room for the imagination of restoration. There would always be someone able to say, we could return it to its place, but once it was torn down. That past was no longer materially available as an option. It passed wholly into the realm of memory. Paintings, drawings, photographs, and scattered artifacts, according to the sources. The dismantling began in 1883 and was completed that same year. From that moment onward, the palace ceased to be merely a ruin and truly became an absence. Imagine those days of dismantling. Unlike the violent night of fire, this must have been a slower disappearance, calmer, almost administrative, and for that very reason. Sad in another way. No more flames, no more red smoke against the sky of Paris. Only the work of human beings upon the corpse of a structure, scaffolding, tools, laborers, the sound of chisels, pulling, the sound of stone being separated from the place where it had once belonged. Piece by piece, the palace departed from the skyline. Sections of wall were brought down. Blocks of stone were carried away. A facade still standing yesterday was lower today. A space blocked yesterday was more open today. This disappearance may have distressed many people even more than the fire itself, because it carried the air of state reason, not the frenzy of civil war, but the lucid will of a new regime choosing not to carry that past forward with it. And yet, even in that dismantling, the Tuileries did not vanish completely. Some parts of the palace were preserved, relocated, or dispersed. Secondary sources note that stone and marble from the structure were sold, and that some fragments later appeared elsewhere, including at Château de la Punta in Corsica, where part of the memory of the Tuileries was recreated in another form. Artifacts, architectural fragments, and traces also continued to live on in museums, in the garden, and in collections. That reveals a paradox, both beautiful and sad. Though the state chose to tear down the palace as a complete whole, the Tuileries survived in many scattered fragments, as though its memory refused to lie still in one place. And then, the emptiness appeared. That is perhaps the quietest character in the final part of this story, and yet the most important. After the Tuileries disappeared, the area between the wings of the Louvre opened out in the way Paris today has grown accustomed to seeing. A broad space leading toward the Tuileries garden, and beyond that, the historic axis stretching westward. The Louvre describes very clearly how today that 6.2-hectare esplanade opens toward the Tuileries garden and farther on to the Champs-Élysées. In other words, modern Paris has been shaped in part by the fact that the Tuileries is no longer there. This is a very deep idea for the ending. Sometimes a city is formed not only by what it builds, but also by what it has chosen to lose. If the Tuileries had been rebuilt, Paris today would have a different line of sight, a different spatial rhythm, a different feeling between the Louvre and the garden. But because the palace was torn down, that emptiness became part of the new Paris. Today, pedestrians may step from the Louvre into the open space without always realizing that they are passing through a void created by history. Not a naturally empty expanse that had always existed. That is what makes the story of the Tuileries so moving. The palace is gone. Yet that very loss continues to live on as an element shaping the city. If one stands there in the late afternoon, in imagination, one can almost feel two Parises layered upon each other. One is the Paris of the present, with its open expanse, its stream of people, light passing across the wings of the Louvre, and the Tuileries garden continuing to breathe as a public space. Beneath it lies the old Paris, where a palace once interrupted that line of sight, once contained dynasties, revolution, empire, ritual, fire, and ruin. Those two Parises do not exclude one another. They live at the same time in the imagination. One exists in stone and pathways. The other remains in memory, in paintings, in photographs, in names, and in that slight ache one feels on learning that the empty place before one once held a vast structure. Perhaps that is the most beautiful thing, and also the saddest. About this ending, Paris went on living without the Tuileries, yet never completely escaped the Tuileries. The garden remains, the great axis remains. The Arc de Carrousel still stands there, like a reminder in stone. The name Tuileries still endures on maps and in memory. The Louvre still opens westward, across a space that was once not empty at all. And the city itself, through the calm persistence of its continuance, transformed that loss into part of its new shape. So if the first chapter of this story began with the land before the palace, then the final chapter closes with the land after the palace. Before there was a Tuileries, it was land of tile kilns and the city's edge. After the Tuileries was gone, it became land of emptiness, of memory, of a line of sight opening toward another Paris. Between those two poles lie more than 3 centuries of history: Catherine de' Medici, the royal dynasties, the French Revolution, the cage of monarchy, Napoleon, the Second Empire, the Commune, fire, ruin, and finally the decision to dismantle. Everything passed across that piece of ground, then left it, but nothing left without depositing another layer of meaning. And when we close this story, what lingers most is perhaps not only the image of the palace burning, nor even the image of it intact at the height of its glory. What remains more deeply is the image of an empty place with memory, a space in Paris where, if one stands long enough, one can almost feel the vanished walls, the extinguished windows, the lines of people that once passed through, the ceremonies that once echoed there, and even the final silence after the stone was taken away. The Tuileries is no more, yet Paris today, in a very quiet way, is still living in the shadow of the form that palace once left behind. And now, as our walk through old Paris gently draws toward its end, the city we have visited tonight also begins to recede once more into stillness. Together, we have passed through a Paris shaped by courts and gardens, by ceremony and tension, by carriages, revolutions, emperors, and the ordinary lives unfolding beneath the shadow of immense stone walls. We have looked upon the Tuileries not merely as a lost palace, but as something far greater, a stage upon which centuries of French history played out one after another, where one regime followed the next, where one dream of power gave way to another, until even that palace itself could no longer remain standing beneath the pressure of history bearing down upon it. And perhaps that is precisely why this story lingers so long in the mind. The Tuileries has vanished, and yet it has never entirely vanished. Its great halls dissolved into fire, its ruins were dismantled, and its material form drifted into the past. But the space it once occupied continues to shape Paris. The gardens are still there. The great axis of vision still stretches westward, and the memory of that palace still lives within the very emptiness where it once stood, as though this city still remembers the outline of something it has lost. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight, and for walking with me through that vanished Paris at such a gentle pace. If this story has helped you relax, You can let me know by leaving a comment with the name of your city, your country, or simply the time at which you are listening. I always love knowing where in the world journeys like this one come to rest. And if you would like to return and continue listening to more slow historical stories, more lost worlds, and more peaceful walks through the past, I would be very glad to meet you here again. And for now, let those old gardens sink slowly into silence. Let that palace recede fully into the realm of memory, and let the night gently carry you into sleep.